Hello, and this is Delia. I'm reading The Struggle. We're on chapter 3, part 2. All the lights in the house were out, including those in the living room. Robert must have gone to sleep already. Even so, Elena held her breath as they crept past the darkened windows. Meredith's car was a little ways down the street. At the last minute, Elena decided to get some rope and she soundlessly opened the back door to the garage. There was a swift current in Drowning Creek, and waiting would be dangerous. The drive to the end of the town was tense as they passed the outskirts of the woods. Elena remembered the way the leaves had blown at her in the cemetery, particularly tall oak leaves. Bonnie, do oak leaves have any special significance? Did your grandmother ever say anything about them? Well, they were sacred to the Druids. All trees were, but oak trees were the most sacred. They thought that the spirit of the trees brought them power. Elena digested that in silence. When they reached the bridge and got out of the car, she gave the oak trees on the right side of the road an uneasy glance. But the night was clear and strangely calm, and no breeze stirred the dry brown leaves left on the branches. Keep your eyes out for a crow, she said to Bonnie and Meredith. A crow? Meredith said sharply. Like the crow outside Bonnie's house that night Yancey died, her little dog. The night Yancey was killed. Yes, Elena approached the dark waters of Drowning Creek with a rapidly beating. I can't see this. Elena approached the dark waters of Drowning Creek with a rapidly beating heart. Despite its name, it was not a creek, but a swiftly flowing river with banks of native clay. Above it stood Wickery Bridge, a wooden structure built nearly a century ago. Once it had been strong enough to support wagons. Now it was just a footbridge that nobody used because it was so out of the way. It was a barren, lonely, unfriendly place. Elena thought. Here and there, patches of snow lay on the ground. Despite her brave words earlier, Bonnie was hanging back. Remember the last time we went over this bridge, she said. Too well, Elena thought. The last time they had crossed it, they were being chased by something from the graveyard, or someone, she thought. We're not going over it yet, she said. First, we've got to look under it on this side, where the old man was found, with his throat torn open, Meredith muttered. But she followed. The car headlights illuminated only a small portion of the bank under the bridge. As Elena stepped out of the narrow wedge of light, she felt a sick thrill of foreboding death was waiting. The voice it said was death down here. Her feet slipped on the damp, scummy stones. All she could hear was the rushing of the water and its hollow echo from the bridge above her head. And though she strained her eyes, all she could see in the darkness was the raw river bank and the wooden trestles of the bridge. Stephen, she whispered, and she was almost glad that the noise of the water drowned her out. She felt like a person calling, "Who's there?" to an empty house, yet afraid of what might answer. This isn't right, said Bonnie from behind her. What do you mean? Bonnie was looking around, shaking her head slightly, her body taut with concentration. It just feels wrong. For one thing, I didn't hear the river before. I couldn't hear anything at all, just dead silence. Elena's heart dropped with dismay. Part of her knew that Bonnie was right. But Stephen wasn't in this wild and lonely place. But part of her was too scared to listen. We've got to make sure, she said through the constriction in her chest. And she moved farther into the darkness, feeling her way along because she couldn't see. But at last she had to admit there was no sign that any person had recently been here. No sign of a dark head in the water either. She wiped cold, muddy hands on her jeans. We could check the other side of the bridge, said Meredith, and Elena nodded mechanically. But she didn't need to see Bonnie's expression to know that they'd find that this was the wrong place. Let's get out of here, she said, climbing through vegetation toward the wedge of light beyond the bridge. Just as she reached it, Elena froze. Bonnie gasped. Oh, God. Get back, hissed Meredith, up against the bank. Clearly silhouetted against the car headlights above was a black figure. Elena, staring with a wildly beating heart, could tell nothing about it except for that it was a male and the face was in darkness. But she had a terrible feeling, and it was moving toward them. Okay, so I'll read the next part in just a second.